Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Allison Flepson. I'm the Reading Program Specialist here at Reading Within Reach and the Global Reading Network. This webinar is coming to you from just outside of Washington, D.C., where the Reading Within Reach initiative and the Global Reading Network are based. And we have colleagues today from Tanzania who will be presenting this webinar. We're very happy to have you joining us from wherever you are in the world. Feel free to send us information about where you are located and the programs that you're working on during today's webinar. So as all of you know from registration, this early grade reading program design and implementation best practices and resources for success is a 5-part webinar series presented by Reading Within Reach in collaboration with the Global Network starting last month in June and going through July. The Reading Within Reach initiative is supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development. That's part of the U.S. government, and it's implemented by University Research Company, or URC. Reach supports the Global Reading Network as its secretariat to help develop and share research, innovations, and resources related to early grade reading programming. Many of you, I'm sure, get our newsletter and have gotten emails about the newest resources and other webinars that the Global Reading Network and Reach are providing to the community of practice that supports work on early grade reading improvement in low and middle income countries. If you're new to Reach or the GRN, you can learn more about us at globalreadingnetwork.net, and you'll see also some information on how to sign up to get our monthly newsletters and other timely updates on events and resources that come out. The presenters for this webinar series are listed in the blue box there. Myself, Allison Flepson, and Amy Palangio, Aristar Limo, and Adrian Barnes from Florida State University. We're very happy to be able to offer this webinar series again. We first offered it back in November, and we've since updated it based on that experience and all the continuing new resources and program experiences that we hear about. So we're looking forward to sharing this again. The purpose of the webinar series overall is to provide the greater community of practice on early grade reading with information about the latest evidence and research on early grade reading improvement, guidance and resources to support design, implementation of effective early grade reading programs. We know there's a huge group of people that are doing this work and that we don't always know what's going on in a country next to ours or what the newest research is. So we hope that we're offering a service in terms of curating some of those good practices that are out there and resources that people are using so that we can learn from each other. We've organized the webinar around some key technical topics. As you know, today is about resources for teaching and learning early grade reading. And so for each of these webinars, we've included brief summaries of research as well as focused a lot on the experiences and best practices that are out there to date around early grade reading improvement. We know that there's a lot of cross-cutting issues that are important to us in our programs and that are also USAID priority issues. Those include gender equity, using information communications technology, and also focusing on inclusive education or making sure that our programs are designed in a way that they reach all learners. We've also, throughout the series, tried to explore issues around monitoring and evaluation. How do we know that the different components of our program are effective and cost effective? And also thinking about expansion and sustainability. We know many programs have been going for several years in pilot phases. They're expanding, and they're also working with governments to ensure that they are self-reliant in their ability to implement the program. So we'll try to talk about those as well so that these webinars are of use to people who might just be starting a program, but also if you've been implementing for a while now, there's still things that we can learn and improve on and think about in terms of sustainability. You'll see throughout we have opportunities for interaction and questions. Of course, by the nature of a webinar, we're not able to necessarily have that kind of a conversation as an in-person event, but we have a lot of space built in that we want to hear from you in the chat. And we want to hear what you're doing and your best practices and challenges that you'd like to share with others. And we have found in the other webinars that we really have been able to engage in that kind of a dialogue, and people have been able to talk to each other in the chat. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Here is just a recap of the sessions that we've already had. The first webinar, June 25th, was an introduction to early grade reading programming. We went through a little bit the U.S. government education strategy, the new USAID policy, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, and how that affects the early grade reading work and how it's expanding into other areas like early childhood. Those materials are now available on the GRN website if you'd like to go there and see the presentation and handout time now. Today, we'll be looking at resources for teaching and learning. And then next week, we'll be talking about early grade reading skills and strategies for effective instruction. So you can sign up to come to that webinar, which is a really useful primer on all the different early grade reading skills and why they're important and what are those good strategies for teaching them. If you've always wondered what phonemic awareness is and what's the best way to teach it, for example, it's a great webinar to get that really useful foundation in that information. On July 24th, we're going to dive into language issues. We've heard from so many people in the community of practice that language really permeates all of the aspects of early grade reading, of course, what languages we're teaching, how we are developing instructional approaches. And so we're going to really explore that in detail on July 24th. Lastly, we're going to, on July 30th, talk about how we support teachers and other educators through continuous professional development on early grade reading. So that will include also looking at coaching, pedagogical coaching, which many programs, of course, include. So we hope that you can join us for these other webinars. And if you haven't already registered, here's the link below, which you can also find on the GRN events page. So I'd like to now take a minute to introduce our wonderful presenters today. Some of them you may already know from other webinars. My colleague Aristark Limo has 8 years of experience in teacher training and literacy program development implementation, working with government, universities, and international NGOs. He started his career as a teacher, so he really knows the challenges and opportunities that exist in the classrooms where we're working. Limo has gone on to develop reading instructional programs that include the development and implementation of teacher professional development activities and the development of appropriate teaching and learning materials like Decodable and Level books for supporting early grade reading instruction. Limo currently works with REACH and the GRN as a training and curriculum development specialist, contributing to planning, designing, and organizing a range of activities related to primary grade reading improvement. He also plays a key role here in supporting the Global Book Alliance, or the GBA, which many of you may have heard about as well. He managed the Enabling Writers program in 6 countries in Asia and Africa. This was a collaboration with the All Children Reading Grand Challenge for Development, where he helped to manage grant recipients to help create appropriate and high quality decodable and level books in local languages that children speak and understand. So we're happy to have Limo joining us from Tanzania. He's co-presenting along with Amy Polanjo. Amy is there on the screen. She has more than 25 years of experience working in education program development and international program implementation with a focus on literacy, government capacity building, and cross-cutting social development issues. She also is based in Tanzania, where she works as an independent consultant. Amy first came to the Global Reading Network and REACH as a technical consultant in 2016, and she's served in a similar role for other organizations, including Creative Associates, the International Literacy Association, the Global Center for Learning and Innovation, and World Learning. And she's been a technical education advisor on U.S. government reading programs in many countries, including Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, Nepal, and the Philippines. So she will be able to share many of those experiences with you. Amy was previously the vice president of a U.S.-based educational professional development organization called the Collaborative for Teaching and Learning. She was also a literacy assessment specialist with Measured Progress. She has a Master's of Education as a clinical reading specialist and a Bachelor of Education in K-12 education and arts education. So we welcome Amy and Limo, and we're going to start now with Amy, who's going to begin our webinar today. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Alice. I'm going to do a brief introduction today before I turn you over to Limo, beginning with looking at the objectives for the webinar. So you can see there are three main objectives for the webinar today, and I won't read those to you. They're there for you to take a look at. One of the things we really know is that a lack of quality and sufficient resources are a problem with supporting quality reading instruction. It's a major barrier to student learning and to their eventual summative performance. And while we would love to be able to have in every country a very wide variety of professionally made resources, sometimes that's not possible. And sometimes the breadth of resources is not really what's necessary, but it is the nature of the resources that is most critical, how they're selected and how they're used. Locally made materials made in context are usually more appropriate for students. There are some risks involved in that, including making sure that they're leveled properly and the quality is what it should be. But it is possible to do that work, and a part of what we're going to really focus on today is that whole kind of grassroots, ground level resource development and the kinds of considerations you have to take in mind, the kinds of processes and steps that are there, ways to control for quality and to get those materials out to students for use in the classroom. So our three main objectives today you can see. And throughout the webinar today, we're going to have a chance to take your questions and comments. We're also going to have pauses throughout the session with specific chat activities going on. And so you want to make sure you can identify and find your chat function. If you don't see it, then you can click on the icon at the bottom of your screen that says chat, and it should pop up on the right side. Make sure when you're chatting that you are chatting to all panelists and attendees. There's a blue bar down toward the bottom right that if you click on it, you'll see all panelists and attendees. You always want to have that clicked on all panelists and attendees. So we're going to actually begin today with a Zoom chat. And you can see some guiding questions on the screen. We really want to start by finding out from you what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, and what's happening in that process. So take a look at the questions on the screen. We will pause for a moment and hope that some of you would like to share via the chat window. So Arturo is noting for everybody that they're working with creating the basic core materials for classrooms, grades 1 through 3 textbooks and teacher's guides. And Arturo, I'm going to go ahead and address a question to you. Inside those student textbooks, I'm assuming you have a combination of reading materials and additional supporting materials. And Nancy is also noting primers and leveled storybooks for mother tongue. And Nancy, can you let us know where it is that you're doing that? So Arturo has confirmed those textbooks include not only student reading materials, but also information activities for building the particular specific core skills that lead to the ability to read. Okay, it seems we're just kind of warming up. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next screen. Just a brief intro before I turn you over to Limo for some new content. This question of why is it so important to invest in early grade reading materials? This may seem like a no-brainer for those of us who are participating in this webinar. However, it is a conversation that has to be had. Many programs focus on using a national textbook or textbooks that may have been in place for a very long time. Sometimes they're accompanied by a teacher's guide, but many times they may not be. Also, no supplementary materials in the classroom. And so really this question of why invest in early grades reading materials, we have to have this conversation with a lot of stakeholders in the work that we do. And of course, we know that children need to have plenty of text, plenty of exposure to different texts, and it needs to be a very diverse set, but also a representative set of text that represents them and children like them, text that represents the context in which they live. And in many low and even middle income countries, there are too few books. They may be in languages that children don't understand. And in many cases, they're leveled at too difficult a level for the grade in which they're being used. In fact, you can see a recent survey. There's a piece of data there for you on the screen. 11 sub-Saharan African countries, only 14% of the books reviewed were found to be appropriate for a beginning reader. So there really is, the lower down in grade levels that you go, there's a lack of sufficient, appropriate, and quality materials for children. So these are the whys for investing in early grades reading materials. And so what is needed? So when we talk about early grades resources, what are we talking about? So when we talk about early grades resources, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. It depends on the goals of your program, what kinds of materials are already available, because we don't want to duplicate those good things that are out there. Also, the time constraints in which you can not only develop, but field test and pilot, refine, get the books out into classrooms, help people know how to use them. And then scale up and sustainability considerations. What kinds of materials are going to be able to be scaled up to a larger number of schools, for example, in a national scale up? And then issues of sustainability. What kinds of things can you provide to classrooms that can be used long term that are not really consumable and temporary kinds of materials? And of course, budget. Efficient approaches to the materials that are needed for large groups of classrooms and large groups of children. And so this includes not only student resources, which is a big portion of the conversation. We have a lot. Of course, student readers or primers, decodable materials, leveled materials as students move forward with their skills, and then also this issue of assistive technologies for children with disabilities. It also includes teacher resources. Teachers need to know how to use these materials. They need to know how to assess the materials. And they also need to have model materials with which they can demonstrate that metacognitive demonstration process to show children what happens when you read, what do you do, what goes on in the brain of a reader when they are learning to read and putting together ideas that create comprehension of text. Then there are the additional classroom resources. These are many times just as critical, if not more critical, than the other materials, because a lot of these help to form the foundational skills that lead children to the place where they can comprehend simple text. And you can see a list of example resources listed there to the right. So this is the why and the what of early grade reading resources. And now we're going to get into what are the characteristics of quality and effective early grades reading resources. And for this portion of the webinar, I'm going to turn you over to my colleague, Limo. Limo.
Thank you, Amy, for providing the objectives of this webinar. I'm going to take you through on the first section, which is looking at the characteristics of effective early grade reading resources. And as we all know, for any program to be successful, it requires a variety of high quality resources to support effective instruction and learning. And this includes resources for both teachers and students, including teacher's guide, student's reader, decodable text, level text, narrative and expository text, big books, and other materials like assistive technology and the flashcards. So I will take you through that. So we are going to start looking at the teacher guide. Teacher guides support teachers in teaching different components of a lesson. And an effective teacher guide includes guidance on teachers, on what skills to teach, how to teach them, and when they should be taught. In this sense, it includes lesson plans that outline what should be taught on a given day. It also includes guidance on student assessment and adapting instruction. Its content should be consistent with the curriculum provided to teachers, the level to which we provide guidance versus the level which we script exactly what teachers should do, and say must be considered depending on the experience of teachers in early grade reading instruction. So for novice teachers, we may need a film guidance. Over-scripting in teacher's guide can limit the extent to which teacher is able to responsive to immediate students, needs and also discourage critical thinking on the part of teacher. So we have to balance to make sure that this teacher guide does not stand as blueprint for teachers to follow, but that we should design a way they will also make teachers think or depending on the needs of their students in the classroom. So balance is a key. And for more information on teacher guides, we would like to refer you on handout 1, which is guidance on the content and design of teacher guides. You will find this handout in the participants package, which has been sent to you in advance before this webinar. Another resources for early grade reading is student reader. Sometimes we call them pupil book, or in other contexts we call them primer. And research has confirmed that children who have books of their own enjoy reading more and read more frequently. The pupil reader or primer is the core widely reading accepted resource for reading instruction. And therefore, it should be simple to access, developmental appropriate, which means in terms of age and the reading ability of the learners. And it should align with curriculum, the national curriculum, and follow a specific scope and sequence. And here we refer to decodable books, which we are going to look to talk about in the next session. So, in addition, it should be structured to have repeated patterns of use, especially for leveled books. And this should include from week to week so that children are able to focus on the content of the book. Not only how to navigate new structure or processes each week, is an ideal that each student should have their own book of appropriate size, with illustrations, and with font that is easy to read. Remember that we are talking about early grade readings, and these are the kids who are learning how to read. Some of them have mastered some of reading skills, but some of them are in the very early stage of learning to read. This is an example of a simple structure for a student book that include all subdomains of reading to allow for interaction from a child and links together reading and writing. And if we can look at that, this is a simple decodable text where you find that it starts with letters that students have learned their phonics. It goes to combining those letters to make syllables, but also combining syllables to make words, and combining those words to make a simple sentence. But it only involves the letters which students have learned their phonics patterns, which means they know the letter sound and they know the letter name. And it provides an opportunity for students to practice writing those letters, and then it ends up with a connected text that has been created using the letters that students have practiced. So this is a sample of decodable text, and this was created by a Nigeria project it's a Nigeria project on numeracy being implemented in Nigeria. So what is a decodable text? Decodable text is a text that a child can decode or sound out. And it can sound out independently based on the letters and phonemes the child has learned. Is a text for the emerging readers, as I have mentioned, and one of who is just beginning to read the books. It's decodable because it provides an experience with reading text linked to phonics scope and sequence, and gradually over a period of weeks and months, increasing children's exposure to new decodable words, that is what they can sound out. So decodable texts are usually short and include a simple sentence or a short fictional story. They came in many forms, and they are sometimes provided in student book and sometimes as supplementary material. Decodable books help children to develop confidence and interest in reading because everything they attempt in that kind of text, everything they attempt to read, they can read, and making reading more enjoyable. So they don't get difficulties in reading any word they encounter in the book or in that text because they have already learned the sounds which make the letters which has created that story. And the more children enjoy reading, the more they read. And the more they read, the better the readers they become. We have a handout we have created for you, which is talking about developing decodable and leveled books. This is handout 2. It's providing a good step-by-step on how you should address, on how you should create this kind of materials to make sure that they are appropriate to the age you are planning. So this handout is very important, and we will encourage you to look at it after this webinar. It gives you steps by step to follow, and it will also be a good reference in the kind of material we'll be looking at the next slide. So in some languages, decodable text may include a few common sight words as long as they have been told. And these sight words are commonly used words that beginning readers are encouraged to memorize by sight so that they can automatically recognize them without having to decode. So sight words should not be part of the scope and sequence, but these are the words which will be used to connect the words so that at least a sentence which these children are reading makes sense. But the students should not learn this word before, but they'll be encouraged to memorize the word so that when they encounter it in the text, they are able to. So another resources which is very important for early grades is leveled text. And this is a kind of text that is matched to the readiness level of the students. So they are created to fit different reading levels of students in a particular classroom. They are not developed to fit a particular grade, but rather to fit individual reading needs in a particular class. So the decodable level text sits at the balance point between not challenging and too challenging. The text usually come in the form of short fictional stories or non-fiction passages, which range from very easy to complex. In some cases, level text is linked to subject matter curricula content for the grade level which that particular book has been developed for. And we integrate it with the curriculum to support both content and learning, as well as to provide children with an opportunity to build their vocabulary and practice fluency. So we don't write this kind of books just for the kids to learn to read, but also to learn some content from the curriculum. Because children reading ability progress at different speed, teachers should be able to continuously assess reading ability of their students so that the text teachers provide at the reading level of the students. In some countries, in some developing countries, you'll find that when the books go to school, a teacher can distribute this kind of materials to children without taking into account these children have different reading abilities. So what we are encouraging here is that before the teacher provide the kit with this kind of materials, the teacher needs to assess the reading ability of her or his students to make sure that the books which he is or she is providing to that kind of kid fit in the kid's reading level. Otherwise, we may provide a leveled book which we think is leveled for that particular kid, but it can be so difficult for the kid to read it, or the book can be so simple for that particular children, depending on the reading skills that children has accumulated. And I will refer you again. I'm not going to ask Alson to pop it out, but there is a good guidance, a good handout 2, which we showed in the previous slide. It also covers the stages for developing leveled text, but also there is another handout called the Reading and Numerous Activity Runner. Is a simple handout which has been developed for guiding development of level readers, and this is being used in Nigeria. Sorry, the fonts are too small, but this is part of the handouts which we have provided with for you before this webinar. So you will see that matrix lays what type of text, the length of the sentence, the punctuations, the fonts, whether the words are repetitive, for every week. So for week 1, the sentences will be shorter and words will be few. For week 2, they will continue to grow up until it reaches, for example, week 7, where you find that it goes up to 35 to 40 words text length. So that matrix, it shows how progressive book development experts and book creators need to follow in order to ensure that the leveled materials they are creating for children in a particular context, they are really going to help these kids learn to read. Other kind of materials we have to support early grade reading is narrative and the expository texts, which are very important in supplementing what we are taking to students of early grades. So narrative and expository text, as I said, is a kind of materials which they need to go in classrooms of early grade reading to support the materials which children are using to learn to read. And for narrative text, tells a story. And in a narrative text, it is easy to find a beginning, middle, and the end of the story. So you can see where the story begins, where's the middle of the story, and where the story ends. Usually, narrative texts have characters. They also have settings. They include conflicts and a theme. So you will find that they are different from early beginning decodable and early beginning leveled text. These are of more high level, but for early grade, that's why it's showing this kind of characteristics. For expository texts, these are structured to explain information. So very young children can read both types of text. As long as the text is properly leveled to the student's reading ability. Simple examples for young learners include providing, for example, a story about magic fairy who grants wishes, and this will be an example of narrative text. And for expository text, which is about information, is for example, providing a text about how to make tea. So you'll find that The one is just for providing a kind of a story, not necessarily to be a nonfiction, is mostly a fiction, but for narrative text, it gives an information on how to do a particular task or how to perform a particular task. But this kind of materials, they should be in the classrooms of early grade readers to make sure that pupils in that particular grades learn how to read, but also learn some information which is necessary in their life. So exposing children to a balance of narrative and expository text early not only prepares them to work with both type of text independently, but also allows reading to be more closely connected to other early grade content areas such as life skills, social sciences, and mathematics. And this helps to creating an early understanding that reading is important to help us learn different things. And I think when they learn in that kind of context, they will know, they will understand why are they supposed to learn to read. Is because we want them to understand different things, and that can be a motivation for these kids to put more efforts in learning to read. Another kind of resources which is also important for early graders is big books. And these are kind of large version of children books meant to be read aloud by teacher to the class. The books are large so that children can see the picture when the teacher holds up the book during the lesson. They are also usually with beginners, with children who are beginning to read, to help them learn concept of print, that is print directionality, but also about the space between the words and where the print is versus the picture. So this is for print knowledge, because you find at this stage, most of these kids cannot read. So, but we want to show them that a text has a direction depending on the type of language which is being used, but also there is a space between words, but also in a text there is a picture and there are words, and both they support each other. But also they are used to build oral language skills and teach vocabulary and other comprehension strategies. And there is abundant research which is talking about effective interactive read alouds, that they should include a systematic approach that incorporates teachers' modeling of higher level thinking, asking thoughtful questions, calling for analytical talk, and promoting children to recall a story in some way. So the teacher does not read this kind of materials to children just by seeking to read, but is one tool of promoting the skills I have mentioned. And these skills will only be enhanced if a teacher reads this kind of book effectively. So if a teacher is reading just for the sake of read, this will not help kids to learn how to read a story and to try to think about what they are reading. That's why we're saying a teacher should read the story and trying to make, to model high level thinking, asking thoughtful questions, calling for analytical talk, and prompting children to read, to recall the story in some way, but also making students to try to link what is being read and their daily life context. So an interactive read aloud is a teaching context in which students are actively listening and responding to oral reading of a text. Read aloud books provide students with a richer exposure to a greater number of vocabulary words and structures that are present in the textbooks. They provide appropriate challenges taking into account that students can understand more sophisticated text than they can read. So a body of research shows that interactive reading allows results in gains in vocabulary and also comprehension strategies. Developing this kind of materials help to develop understanding of story structure and print awareness, as I have mentioned. It also helps teacher to teach the reading process in a meaningful context. Also help teacher to model the fluence and motivating students to read. So you'll find that read alouds, though they are being read by teachers, but there are a lot of strategies being involved to make sure that children concentrate listening the story, but also try to think what is the story about and try to link what is being read with their daily life context. And beyond provision of developmental appropriate text, it is important to have other learning aids in the classroom, such as letter and word cards, pictures to promote language development, posters to make a print-rich environment, and manipulatives which students can actively engage. So in early grades, we need to bring in plenty of materials so that children get opportunity to interact with these materials for the purpose of improving their learning skills. It's real important that all these materials go to the classroom so that we have students who are able to read in their early age as research evidence requires. Otherwise, we all know in our developing country context, there are very shortage of materials, and you may not find this kind of materials in the classroom. You may not find it decodables, and it comes a time that we go in a classroom where you find no any kind of text to read for the kids. But as we all know, we have to bring abundance of materials to the classroom which are appropriate to their age level for them to be able to develop their reading skills in their early ages. These resources are simple to make, which means that these materials I have mentioned are simple to make and important to introduce sounds, words, and skills. In some programs, you find these materials developed by the program implementer, and in other contexts, you find teachers are trained to make them and engage in creating them as part of their training or coaching. So the decision about how to provide them will be program specific, but the importance in any setting cannot be overstated. Yeah, this is a sample of other materials which have been used in different programs. And this is also, again, coming from Nigeria Reading and Numerous Activity, RANA, and FHI 360, where this kind of materials are used to build, for example, words, syllables. These are the cards I was mentioning. As you can see there, kids are interacting with these cards to create words. And these words are creating are the words which they have already learned their sounds and letters, and therefore they can pick different cards with different letters, put them together to create a word. There are other kind of materials, as you can see, and you can see children in front of the class trying to interact with these materials. So these are some additional images of resources and their active use happening in the classroom. Even though a training manual and a student book are essential, they are not sufficient to prompt teachers to be creative and student-centered in their practices. So materials like posters, pictures, and a variety of tools which a student directly engage with can send a valuable message to teachers about the type of pedagogue that is most effective with young learners. And you will find this handout in the handouts we have provided. So you can look at the participants package we have sent to you after this webinar and get more details for this handout. So beyond the textbooks, beyond the books, we have technology as a resource. And as we all know, technology is more widely available every day and almost everywhere. Some simple technology can support literacy acquisition for young students by increasing access to text through digital books. Also provide ongoing models and support for teacher professional development as a tool to gather and respond to continuous assessment evidence and for use of application that provide instruction to students. So while use of technology is increasing, it is important to note that teachers require substantial training, not only to use the content that is made available, but also to support technical use of the hardware and software. They also need considering whether to provide technology to the classroom. When considering providing technology to the classroom, it is important to consider available infrastructure to support it, such as regular power, internet access, and availability of local technical support. We know some contexts in developing countries, these infrastructures are not available. And we are not saying because these infrastructures are not available, we should not send them technology, but we should have to find structures which will support the technology which we are sending to such kind of context. Or we should start by constructing a supporting infrastructure for this technology to be useful in the classroom and in the learning environment. So technology can be available too, but can also be an effective use of funds if the practical logistics to support its use are not in place or unreliable. So technology as a resource in LA grade reading programs can support different kind of activities, including tracking the materials going to school, or assisting coaches and supporting teachers, but also to identify and support children with learning impairment. So this is another use of technology that beyond integration into classroom instruction, technology is for purpose of supporting what is taking place in the classroom. And this includes purposes like tracking delivery of resources to schools, and we have now track and trace programs being tested in different areas. And these track and trace programs or track and trace solutions in LSUs to limit resource loss across the book supply chain, which is a major problem in developing countries. So there are a lot of pilots going on the ground in different parts of the world in ensuring that we find solutions to address the loss of materials as they move from the supplier to schools. And we have plentiful resources where you can go to refer about these kind of solutions for book supply chain. We have provided you with 3 presentations that were presented at the CAS this year. And they talk about track and trace solutions which have been in place and have been tested in different countries. And they are really working well to support tracking books from where they are being produced or printed, and track them as they move from point 1 to point from the supplier to schools all the way. So this technology helps to make sure that the books or the materials being sent to school, they can have the technology can help you to understand at which point they have reached and at which point they have not reached, and they have reached in whether the amount which was desired or the amount which was desired. So using these technologies will help you to address the deficiencies which will be happening in the supply chain. So these resources I have mentioned that we were presented at CIS have been included in the resource list and reference we have provided. It's like a 4-page document, which we encourage you to go to look at, and you will see the links which will take you to this kind of resources. In addition, technology is available too to support professional development in a wider ranging and diverse settings. By providing coaches with simple tablets, for example, loaded with application that include a process for gathering data and material to respond to teacher professional development needs, coaches can provide critical data for program use, also have ongoing guidance in their coaching activities, and provide teachers with timely feedback and support. This kind of technology is being used in most of early grade reading program being implemented in developing countries, and they are being real helpful in teacher professional development coachings. So technology can be used to support students with specific learning impairments, such as limited vision or hearing loss. And in developing contexts, use of these assistive devices and assistive software is still limited, but many governments are poised through policy revisions and the early pilot program to increase the systematic use of technology support for students with disability in an integrated classroom setting. So for more reference, please go to the presentations from CIS to a reference and resource list we have provided. And now that we have discussed a variety of resources for teaching and learning in early grade reading, we would like to spend some few minutes. We would like you to spend some few minutes to reflect your own programs and its resources to support teaching and learning in early grade reading. We will ask you to use the chat function to let us know how teaching and learning in early grade reading, to let us know how would you address what is missing in your program, but also what challenges did you experience in developing the materials, and how did you go through the challenges? And we would like you to share with us your feedback on these questions, on these reflections. And when you share, please share with both panelists and participants. So we'll pause for a moment for you to try to reflect to your programs and share with us what is missing in your program, what challenge did you experience in developing those resources, and how did you go through those challenges. And of course, if you have questions for the section I have just presented, you can also send as you send the charts. There's a question here asking, is EGRA materials used for pre-primary students? For these ones which we are addressing here is starting grade 1 up to grade 3 to 4, but there are specific materials which are used for pre-primary, but they are not part of this presentation. This is focusing mostly early primary grades.
And Limo, can I add to that as well? This is Amy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
In pre-primary, one of the critical things that's important for children is to have access to a lot of image-rich text. So very few words, lots of images. so they can begin to do oral storytelling and discuss images as they contain information that students can comprehend through speaking and listening. Also, it's important to provide good quality read aloud books for teachers at pre-primary as well. The big books and the interactive read alouds become even more important at that level in terms of building pre-reading skills, the understanding of concepts of print, the building of rich oral vocabulary, the understanding that you can examine something, whether it's words or images, to help you understand something. So the basic concept of comprehension. Lima, we also have a comment about early grades English levels being very poor in Indian schools and the difficulty of providing common reading materials when in any individual setting the skills levels are so very different. And this, I think, is linked to what Limo talked about in his presentation about the idea that the books really need to be leveled to the individual student. So for a single classroom, you have to provide a wide variety of levels so that you can really capture all students on that range from very low skills to very high skills. So one of the things to consider with leveled text is, you know, how do you provide them in terms of, are you talking about full class sets? Are you talking about one copy? Are you talking about 5 copies? And so those are all decisions that have to be made within a program. And really it requires a lot of research back into what exists, what the real status in schools is for children, what the breadth of learning levels might be in the particular context or setting. We're going to go into that more, this issue of research, in the next session.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. And also there is another challenge being shared that in one of the contexts where a program was working to provide supplementary materials to school, they went through difficulties because the government was only focusing on textbooks, and therefore it was they were not supporting this kind of materials since they are not part of government materials which they take to school regularly. And so the program, however, managed to train teachers on how to create this kind of materials by their own. And this is very common in most of developing countries who mainly have been focusing providing textbooks, but not giving the value they deserve for supplementary materials. So it requires some efforts when you work with such governments to educate them, to educate the ministry, to educate the people who are in the curriculum centers on the importance of this kind of materials, especially for early graders to learn to read. Because the textbooks which are being provided are mostly supporting academic subjects, but these academic subjects are not going to be successful learned if children in that particular context miss reading skills. So as I have said, it's better to engage the government from the beginning as you design the program so that they understand in advance what type of materials you are going to send to school when you start implementing your program. And some government will require to look at the materials, though they may not have experts for the kind of materials you have developed. So it's still challenging.
I think it's also important, Limo, to engage government directly in the materials development. So as opposed to program implementers developing separately, develop in collaboration with government so that the materials that are developed, whatever they are within the government kind of work scope and system from the beginning. And therefore, you know, the struggle with having supplementary materials approved by government, if they're developed outside of that kind of process, that struggle tends to go away pretty quickly if they're actively engaged in the actual development process as a partner.
So I think, let me welcome Amy to take you through section 2, which is focusing on developing and using effective early grade reading resources. Amy, please.
Okay. Thanks, Limo. So with all those different kinds of resources that Limo talked to you about, it's important to really look in depth at how it is that you actually can get this done. And so this section of the webinar is going to take you through the steps in the process to create materials and to get them out into schools. I want to refer you in your review of the session later on to handout 5. There's a series of key activities, questions, and considerations. There's also some references there for you to take a look at the variety of things you have to consider when you do materials development for early grades. And I'm going to now move us to the next screen and start taking us through the process. So the first thing you have to do, and this reflects back to what we just talked about, is engage all the relevant stakeholders. Get them involved from the beginning, and keep them involved throughout the process. This includes not only Ministry of Education, as we've talked about, including government, but also practicing teachers, other people in the community who are linked to the schools or linked to book production, for example, local publishers. One of the things that can really be a good outcome from program materials development is increased knowledge of local publishers, increased profiles and work of local publishers to make sure that even in the private sector, good materials are more and more available to not only schools but families over time. It also includes making sure you get reading experts in, but also language experts. And sometimes, and in fact, in many cases, these are not the same people. The language experts and the reading experts run in parallel circuits. They don't always work together. They don't always talk together. And it's critical that both roles are involved. And also involving children to find out what they like to read, what kind of materials are most engaging for them, what are the topics they're interested in. So getting children involved in the process as well. So figure out who your key stakeholders are, make sure they're represented in the process, get them engaged at the beginning, and keep them engaged. Then, of course, you need to form a materials development team. The materials development team doesn't necessarily include all of these stakeholders listed there in step number 1, but it should be a fairly diverse team. It should be people who understand the context, work and live inside the context, work and live and speak in the tongue that is being used to create the books. Also people with technical skills, a diversity of ethnicities, religions, ages, roles, organizations. So making sure that anyone and everyone who's going to be touching these books, approving these books, providing access to them, supporting their delivery to schools, that all of these people are involved in the team. So this is a big one. To conduct research, and I referenced this in my comments at the end of Limo's session as well. Many programs, I have seen many programs that not only build, of course, development of materials into their program design, which is critical to do, but then they immediately begin to implement without taking a step back and conducting the kind of research that needs to be conducted. So the first thing to look at is, what do you know about how well students are performing? And to give you a general sense of the breadth and scope of materials that you're going to need to provide in terms of and the sequence, the pace at which students are building skills, because it's different from country to country. You may see in some countries a core phonics approach that focuses on letter and sound association in depth for a year. You may see in another country it's over a period of 2 years. And so looking at what students are studying, how well they're doing, how that links to the reading curriculum and the scope and sequence for language development is critical to know your delivery scope. So to what extent do we need to provide decodable books? To what extent do we need to provide leveled books? And how are those leveled books going to need to spread out over a period of years based on student assessment data and the national curriculum? We have to make sure we're very knowledgeable about the language structure, how the language is used, the nuances of the language, particularly if we are an outside implementer who is not native to the context in which we are working. I referenced already talking with publishers and printers, getting them engaged, finding out what it is that they have available and can or are already providing to schools. Then taking a look at the existing materials, what's being provided by government, what has been provided by previous programs, not duplicating the good work that is out there, but instead using your resource development resources to fill the gaps that are there and fill the gaps that are responsive to children's learning needs, to the scope and sequence for learning, and to the national curriculum. Then you need to take a look at teacher knowledge and skills in terms of their ability to teach. Because again, we're not only talking about student materials, but we're talking about the kinds of teacher support materials and even training that is needed to make sure those student resources are used effectively. Allison, can you pop handout 6 up for just a minute and scroll down through that? I want you to, after this webinar, really take a look at handout 6. I can't emphasize enough the importance of taking the time to conduct the necessary research. And if you'll just scroll down through, you can see there are some guiding questions up front. And then there's step-by-step information with more detail than what I've shared here in the webinar about what you need to look at in terms of areas of research that should take place before you determine what materials you're going to develop. So you can see the assessment data, there's more information there, policy documents as well, how the language is used, what language is used and how it's used in schools, even language transition. When do students potentially transition from mother tongue to a second language for instruction? Program objectives for reading and the national curriculum, and it goes on. So please make sure you take a look at this particular document if you're putting in place plans to create materials. This is one of the areas that I think is under focused in terms of materials development. And we end up, when we don't do the research, we end up creating materials that may be good, but they may not be precisely what's needed. So the next step in development is obtaining stakeholder agreement on copyright and licensing. And this issue of copyright and licensing may seem like a very small issue, but it's not a small issue. And it needs to be done upfront before any development takes place. Because it affects the way in which the materials will be available and used in the future. Currently, a really recommended practice is to go with open licensing. Open licensing grants anyone permission to either reproduce or adapt the materials, to distribute them and use them in any way that they want to. Of course, open licensing does not negate the original developer, the original creator of the materials. They should always be noted and referenced in the licensing agreement and in the books. But what it does do is it allows for materials to be much more broadly available. Sometimes this is an issue when working with book publishers. There's a lot of work going on with publishers now to help them understand that open licensing actually is not a problem for them. It doesn't limit their ability to sell materials. It actually can enhance their work in the long run. An agreement on how you're going to copyright materials, how you're going to license them, needs to be clearly in place with everyone agreeing to that before you do any book development. GRN has been doing a series of webinars on this topic, and you can see it in the small box at the bottom. And there will be another one. There was one today. Okay, July 10. Open license business models for Asia. So you can go to our website and you can find the older URLs. They're also in a handout in your packet as well. And then take a look at these if you're interested in this issue of licensing and copyright. Okay, so you have to have a plan in place. And this is another step that is very important and should be given plenty of time. Not only taking the time to do the research, making sure then, of course, you stop get everyone on the same page with copyright, but then a plan for materials production. Materials production can take quite a long time, and it's a complicated process. It's quite doable. The steps in that process are really not complex, but the number of activities that have to take place are fairly complex. And so to back map the process, knowing when do you have to deliver materials to schools, and take the process backwards to put together a materials production plan. Handout 7 is a really good example, and please don't let it scare you. Handout 7 is a really good example. And can you go to the second page of Handout 7 so people can take a look at the map that's there, the materials development process map. You have this in your materials packet, but I wanted you to just get a look at the complexity of the plan that has to be put in place. And if you could just continue to slowly scroll down so that the participants can see how many steps and the interrelated links between those steps that have to take place. So there's a whole startup and planning period that's got multiple steps. And when you see this in large scale, you'll see that it actually has a number of weeks or months tagged to every single activity. There's the development of base documents. Base documents are those documents like scope and sequence or leveling guides, or frequently used word lists, generic lesson templates, all of these things that have to be in place before you do development. Reviewing those documents, validating those processes and documents, and then, only then, do you actually begin to get to the development of materials. And so development takes a number of steps, including field testing and revision. No materials, no matter how great your development team is, no materials will be ready for production and delivery to schools. They need to go out and be pilot tested in a small number of schools, feedback received, and usually revised in almost every single case. And then we move to a large chunk of activity beyond that, which is printing, copying, packing, distributing, the supply chain issues when those products begin to actually move out into the field to be used by schools. So again, this whole development of a process document is critical to make sure that you know what you're taking on, that it can get done inside the time period that you have to do it. And so getting this plan in place down to the tiniest detail is very important. Okay, we can take that down and go to the next slide on the PowerPoint. Step 6, developing the resources themselves. So when you have your plan in place, then you've got to begin those early structures, identifying lessons that are needed. Now you may be asking, wait a minute, I thought this was materials development. We recommend that if you're creating student materials, student reading materials, that you attach those always to resources for teachers to know how to use them. And one of the simple ways to do this is to attach those materials to guided lessons. And Limo discussed earlier the difference between scripted lessons and guided lessons, and finding a balance between those things so that teachers are in a position where they have sufficient guidance, but they also need to make some decisions based on evidence in their classroom. So knowing how much you have to create, creating structures, using a scope and sequence to understand your content, to guide the content development, and the leveling guide, the decodable up to leveled kind of guide that Limo showed you earlier. How is it going to be designed? What is it going to look like? How are the student materials and teacher materials going to work together? And then begin to brainstorm the topics and ideas that would be engaging to children. This involves both the expository text and the narrative text that Limo talked about earlier, and then developing the content itself in context for children that are specific in that context. And also very critical to make sure inclusion issues get addressed. There is a good supporting document from USAID. I think you can actually just Google inclusion policy from USAID, and it will give you some good information to support what they mean by inclusion and what you have to consider. Also, in the enabling writers and Bloom resources that are noted on this screen, The Enabling Writers program has several guidebooks to take you through this entire process from beginning to end. And it also includes a whole specific emphasis on inclusivity and inclusion issues to make sure that the materials produced for children are visually and tactily inclusive, meaning they can be produced in ways that are appropriate for children with physical disabilities of any kind. They also are inclusive and balanced in terms of gender, minority populations, whether that is ethnic or religious or language minorities. All of those issues are also addressed in the Enabling Writers materials that are referenced on this page. Okay, conducting quality control. I noted just a few minutes ago that you need to expect that your materials will need to go out for piloting. They will come back and they will likely have to be revised because no materials are going to be perfect. But one of the ways in which we can get at quality control early on is we can maintain a quality control point of view from the very beginning of the process. You saw that map of laying out the process. That in itself is initiating quality control from the very beginning. But also during development of the resources, you need to monitor the quality during development. There needs to be a standard process inside the development work for verifying difficulty of text, the readability and complexity. So if you have a leveling guide that lays out what people should be developing for which grade level and for which developmental level, all the way from decodable through leveled text, then you need to be using that leveling guide to monitor and check the draft text that's being developed for students in particular. Also paying attention when your development team is straying from the design elements that you want in the materials, and also that review needs to include an inclusion review. That is not only about how people are represented in the text, but it's also about how those materials can be adapted for students with disabilities. Are they being developed in a way where the adaptation and the access for students with disabilities is simple to accomplish? And then the planning resources for teachers as well. So here is this issue of field testing. Once you've mapped out your plan, you've developed your materials, you've monitored quality during development to get them as good as you can, they have to go out and be field tested. So the way in which you field test provides information on the level of difficulty of the text. Is that text actually written at a level for the students you were intending it for, and are they able to access it? Is it too difficult? Is it too easy? What's the range at which it's useful to students? This references back to Limo's comment about text needing to be balanced in the center, not too easy so that students are not challenged, and not too difficult so that students don't have access to the materials at all. Also, getting information back from the learners themselves about which of the materials they're most interested in reading, which were most engaging for them. Information back from pilot or field testing teachers on whether they were able to effectively use the resources. Are they contextually appropriate? Are they inclusive? Do we see the students, all of the students we should see in the text and materials? And the larger issues of design elements and readability, font size, font type, image size, and design elements of the materials themselves. There is a good handout in your materials that provides guidance on field testing. A field test does not have to be large. A field test simply has to look at the correct elements and collect the correct data, including all of these different sets of data that are shown on the screen. So after materials are field tested and refined, then you're ready for printing and distribution, getting it from the warehouse to the school. This is where all of the studies and all of the presentations on track and trace that were referenced in Limo's presentation will be useful to you. So you've got to not only include in that early plan a development process, but you saw as we scrolled to the last page of that map, printing and distribution plan as well. This also needs to include guidance to schools about storage, management, and use of materials. It is not unusual for programs to provide materials to schools and then to come to those schools for other activities, maybe training or mentoring or site visit, and find that those schools are still boxed up and waiting to be distributed through classrooms. So you also need to verify that when you go out into schools, taking a look at where the resources are located, how are they housed, what condition are they in, and how are they used, and are they actually in the hands of teachers and children. Then your last step in this process is this continual monitoring and evaluating of how they're used. Your field test looks at their level of appropriateness and quality for the context, but this ongoing monitoring and evaluation looks at how often, in what ways, and how well they are used, as well as the impact that they have on the teacher's instruction and the impact that they have on student performance. There is a handout number 14, that can give you some more information on printing and distribution. So this is the end of my section on the process for development, and we're going to pause for a Zoom chat activity so you can see on your screen. So if you look at all of these recommended steps for materials development all the way through to monitoring of use, we want to know which of these do you think is most important in your own work, in your own process of development, as you have done this kind of activity. Which do you find to be more important and why? And which of these kinds of steps is most difficult in your work? Also, if you've got any advice for other people, please share it. Using student interviews during field testing is a great idea. In fact, that's a recommended idea, to take a look at laying materials out in front of the kids, those materials they were able to use and access during field testing, and talking with them about which of those books were easiest for them to read, which were most difficult, which were most engaging and interesting, and why. Really asking the question for them of why, to get an answer to one of the key questions, which is, have we developed the right level and type of materials for this particular type of student? And we've got Marian, who talks about in DRC using Bloom to create early grades materials. There's a lot of places now where Bloom has been used for materials development, including through the Enabling Writers work that both Limo and I worked on with the Global Reading Network, and Nancy also using Bloom. Bloom is an interesting tool because not only does it allow you to preload some information, for example, decodable levels and leveled book levels. It allows you to preload scope and sequence, also some frequently used words. And then Bloom provides you with a process where if your development team, if a writer moves beyond the boundaries of the text they are supposed to be writing in terms of its level of difficulty and appropriateness, Bloom notifies the writer that they have surpassed the boundaries of the level of text they are supposed to be writing, and they have to go back and revise. So it controls for drift away from particular levels of text that they're supposed to be creating. So we've got a lot of Bloom users on here. Nora also using Bloom for developing supplementary readers. Yeah, Marian says it's hard to say what are the right boundaries, though, in Bloom. I think, Marian, this is also why a continual quality monitoring process using a specific leveling guide is critical, even when you're using a technology that assists you in creating boundaries for your writers. So I know in Enabling Writers, even though we were using Bloom, we also did our monitoring checks directly with a leveling guide, and word counts and sentence wrap checks and page counts, placement of images, all of which can be provided if you create a very detailed leveling guide. Okay, I'm watching our time, so I think what I'm going to do now, if anyone continues to add to the chat on this topic, I will respond in writing. But right now what I'm going to do is turn you back over to Limo for the last section of the webinar, Developing Resources for All Learners.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to take you through again in this section, which is looking on developing resources for all learners. And when we are focusing on developing resources for multiple languages simultaneously at scale implementation. And we have a case study of Ghana. The screen you are looking at now. This is a brief on a case study from Ghana, where a program developed resources for multiple languages in large scale implementation. So when you are faced with having multiple languages of instruction and the need to develop resources simultaneously, you should use the recommendations included in the prior slides, but also keeping in mind that your human resource needs will multiply, the time and funds you need will increase, and the checks on alignment should be carefully conducted at all steps along the way to ensure that one, no set of resources is of insufficient quality, and two, the resources are not only aligned with the language, but also aligned across languages to ensure equity of access and quality. So when you are developing this kind of materials, you really need to be very careful to make sure that you are coming with the materials which will fit for multiple languages and which will be effective in teaching reading in those languages. For the next slide, and you can refer our handouts we have provided, and we have handout for 15 here, which is referring for this case of Ghana. Another case is for developing resources for multiple languages is from Mozambique, a program called Mozambique Vamos Lá, which means let's read. This was a program implemented by Creative Associates, and it is the largest investment in bilingual. So the program works to improve early grade literacy in 3 languages, along with second language acquisition to support children's transition to Portuguese. So this is a very useful a reference we encourage you to look at the end of this webinar or at any time when you get time. It is very useful to give you some tips and guidance on how effectively you can develop this kind of materials for multiple languages. And we have a presentation by Creative Associates, which was presented at CIS, providing highlights on this kind of program. This presentation is available in the resource and reference lists we have provided. There is a link which will take you there for more reference and details. So we encourage you to really look at this presentation if you have a program or if you are aiming to implement a program for multilingual material development. And now let's look on the best practices for developing materials content. In the past, an effort to provide materials in setting where the need was urgent and exceptional, there was a tendency to try to provide resources designed for one context to another context. And we could call it a bad aid approach to resources provision. So this was not an effective approach, since resources that have no link to the specific context are not effective and thus not used for any substantial length of time. And that's why we are encouraging to develop materials which reflect a particular context which that program will be implemented. And these materials should use local languages that are being spoken and understood by learners which these materials are targeting. So in current context for resources provision, resources are usually created locally with the specific context to ensure that the language is accurately addressed and authentic to existing, authentic to context of culture and students, is integrated to these materials, and the resources themselves are tied to the existing policy, guidance documents, developmental expectation, and the practice goal. So there are a lot of factors to observe here, and all are very important as they support each other. You may develop materials which support the reading levels and they have the quality, but if you have not looked to the existing policy and guidance documents, these materials may not reach the school because government may intervene. As we all know, some government and most of them in developing countries will require for their experts in the ministry or in the curriculum development to look at the materials, to evaluate the materials before they go to school. So these are very important factors to look at when you are developing materials for content. So while this is an optimum approach, it is possible in some settings to begin with existing resources from another context, or they can be existing resources from in the same context, but they are not leveled appropriate to fit the context itself. So you can start from there, reviewing them and try to make them appropriate to that context. Or it can be materials from another context and try to adapt them resources, those resources within a new context. So in order for this approach to be effective, you must address issues of language, curriculum, and cultural context, but also working with local development group that has first-hand knowledge of these issues. And here including Ministry of Education, curriculum development centers, language expert, material development expert in that particular context, although they may not have expertise in developing that kind of materials you're looking at, but they will be very helpful for the program to develop the kind of material the program intends, and which will help students in that particular context. So it is important to have clear guidelines on readability for children at a specific grade level and at specific times within those grades. That's why we're insisting before you start developing any kind of material, you must set parameters, you must set standards. And here we are talking about the scope and sequence, the leveling criteria, so that it guides you in developing these materials. It's also critical to understand and handle the overall developmental aspect of young learners and issues of inclusion. This is very important to make sure that every child gets an opportunity to learn to read. So the materials must cut across different children with different abilities. Here we refer those who have poor vision and blind, but also trying to ensure that the issue of gender is addressed. That material should have to address both girls and boys in an equal way. Otherwise, they'll be challenged, and we want to help some programs which are already in place, mostly local programs, who have not had that much exposure to kind of materials to support early grade reading. So these issues are very important. So by creating a leveling guide or tool that addresses all of the issues noted, you will provide clear boundaries for young development team, including text difficult and complexity ranges and text design elements such as size of the book, font type and size, issues of spacing, and issues of wrapping text. We understand at a certain level, we are not required, we are not allowed to wrap the text because the students are beginning to read. And as you wrap the text, they think that where the sentence is wrapping is where the sentence ends. So they will not get a good connection of where the sentence is wrapping to the following sentence. Another important element that should be developed in your leveling guide focuses is the issue of equity and inclusion, as I have mentioned, and with international and positive integration of people with difference, gender, culture, religion, and disability. So we are not saying that all these materials focus every and only thing which are available in that particular context, but we are saying that they should also look at the other context, like international context, and integrating different people of different gender, of different color, so that to expose the children to the real world while they are at their early ages. Quality control is critical during development and during field testing, and this is necessary prior to printing or distributing materials to schools. So during development, we need to conduct a regular spot check on draft text to ensure that it is consistent with all criteria on your leveling guide. If we find issues, work with individual developers to provide feedback and guidance on areas where the product is inconsistent, and continue to monitor over time to make sure that these books, when are approved for school, they are of high quality. So there are several handouts we have provided you there, handout 16, handout 17, and handout 18. They are in the participants package we have sent, but we are insisting that children quickly lose interest in reading books that do not relate to their life experience, and also children lose interest in reading books that do not pique their interest. Children will not select books to read that do not grab their attention, and children will not continue to read books that bore them. So those references have a lot of information that will share with you best practices that have been applied in different contexts, and now you can apply them in your context to make sure that the materials you are developing are of high quality and they are appropriate to the reading level of the target group. Section 3 is that much few, and now that much short, and now we have handout 5, which is about planning for materials development and use. It shows key activities, question, and consideration to guide the planning and the materials quality control. So we would like you to reflect on that handout. As you reflect, try to reflect when thinking about your existing program material, what are the gaps you now think you may need to address? So you look at the gaps in your program, which you think you will now need to address, and how might you go about that process. But also, we will request that you chat with us where are the real gaps in your resource development use process, and how you use suggestions from today's webinar to close the gaps. So this is the handout, is handout 5. If you have downloaded the participant package we sent you prior to this webinar, you'll have this handout. So look at it, try to reflect and think about your existing program materials. What are the gaps you now think you may need to address, and how might you go about that process based on the presentation we have done here. And please chat with us the gaps and the suggestions you have for addressing these gaps. So other handouts, handout 16 describe issues related to readability and design, and handout 17 explain what a text difficulty, complexity, and readability. But for this assignment, we want you to look at the handout 5.
And if you don't have handout 5 in front of you, just take a look at the reflect and chat questions. What's missing from your program in terms of a comprehensive set of materials? How might you go about developing those? And in terms of your process for what you have done to create materials, the steps in the process, did you miss something? Is there something you can go back and check on to confirm that your materials are of the quality that you want them to be? Limo, I'm going to go ahead and take this first question from Samantha,
Okay.
where she references that we've given a lot of technical guidance, but how do we go about gauging engagement? There's a number of steps along the way where you can take a look at that. First of all, we talked early on in the process about getting children engaged in the process. You can actually put together small focus groups of children and talk with them in advance. What do they like to read? Bring books and put them in the room with children. Have them choose the ones that they want to look at. Talk to them about why those are books that they want to read and want to use. Also, this engagement issue is critical in field testing. You will likely gather more data in field testing from students than you will gather from teachers. Again, putting a number of your materials in a single classroom over a period of a week or 2 weeks, allowing children to access them in multiple kinds of ways, going in and gathering information. What did you like to read the most and why? What did you like to read the least and why? Which books would you choose to read again? Which books would you like to have in your classroom? And get the why questions in there. And students will be able to tell you what kinds of books are of interest to them. One of the things that I have found interesting myself in those discussions is that what we as adults think of as engaging books is not necessarily the same as what children would think of. For example, when we might ask ourselves the question, what's a high quality children's book? Some of the things that may come to mind is colored images, hardbacks, slick pages, big pages. These are not necessarily the things that children will tell you. The things that are most important to them are seeing other children like themselves in the book, someone they can connect to. Circumstances, activities, and events in the book that are familiar to them and similar to the kinds of life experiences they have. Books that include big adventure, books that include family. These are all the kinds of things that children find most engaging. So it's an interesting activity to ask children in multiple ways what they're interested in, and sometimes the answers are very surprising. We have a question about coaching, and we're not able to address that today, but I want to encourage you to join the webinar on the 30th of July, which is Continuous Professional Development, which focuses on training, but actually focuses mostly on coaching, approaches to coaching, different kinds of coaching support resources. So I encourage you to join that webinar. So from the webinar today, there's some critical things that we think are important for you to remember. And you can see them there on the screen. It is important to have a variety of materials for children. It actually really requires a very detailed planning process and development process to do it well. There are a lot of common characteristics of what high quality materials look like. Making sure everybody who needs to be involved is really, really critical for every reason that we've talked about earlier in the session. And as Limo put so well at the end of his session, when children read books that are written specifically for them, this is what works. And so lots of resources are important. Resources in context are important. So if you would like to share in the chat any of your takeaways or any final questions that you have for us today, I can see people are continuing to post. Yeah, Delia notes that one thing that seems to be missing in decodable books is guidelines for what level the book is at. or what the goals are for learning. Delia, this happens sometimes when there are no teacher resources linked to the books, no resources given to the teacher. That kind of information should actually be included in the teacher supporting resources that come along with those level books and decodable books. So we want to thank you for participating. We're coming to the very last minute of our time. You can see there on the screen, if you have any more things that you'd like to talk about, you can contact Limo, you can contact myself. Our emails are there. We want to thank you for joining, and we want to encourage you to sign up for the remaining 3 webinars in this series. They will all take place this month. We'll be finished with this series by the end of July. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Limo. And Allison, thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, everyone.